So, good afternoon to everyone. We'll start now the second panel of the day. My name is Ziv Rabinovitz. I'm a PhD from the University of Haifa and a research fellow at the Hiking Chair for Geostrategy here at the university. We have here four distinguished speakers who will give us international perspectives of this war, and we will need to keep time very efficient here, so 15 minutes every one of them, and I'm here to enforce that. I will introduce everyone before they speak, and the first one will be Professor Avraham Ben-Zvi, who is a full professor in the Division of IR at the School of Political Sciences and at the University of Haifa, and the winner of the Israel Prize in Political Science and International Relations for 2020. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in Political Science in 1973. He worked at the Tel Aviv University Department of Political Sciences and chaired it twice, and then moved to the University of Haifa, where he established three programs. One is the Executive MA Program in Negotiations and Decision Making in International Relations, that's in Hebrew, and also the International MA Program in Diplomacy Studies and the Dual Degree International Program in International Relations with the University of Warsaw. He had published 12 academic books and dozens of scholarly articles on a variety of issues related to the shaping of U.S. foreign policy since 1945, with a special emphasis on the origins, dynamics, and evolution of the U.S.-Israel relations. And his most recent book, forthcoming, written jointly with Dr. Gadi Valsha, is entitled Israel's Foreign Policy 1948 to 2018, Selected Issues, which is in press right now with the Open University. So, Professor Ben-Zvi.
Okay, thanks very much. My good friend Ziv, welcome to all of you. My mission is impossible because, first of all, I feel much more comfortable in predicting the past than predicting the future, so I'll focus on predicting at least part of the past, and I'll be on the safer ground, but essentially it's an unfolding topic, and it's still fluctuating, and by the end of the day, much of what I'll have to say would inevitably become outdated and anachronistic. So instead of offering a few policy options, let me first of all begin with the basic caveats and parameters of the Biden administration in foreign policy, and to see how they evolved, were shaped, delineated, and modified as a result of the war in the Ukraine. So number one, I don't believe, contrary to many others, that there was an irreconcilable gap between the foreign policy strategy initiated by Biden and the foreign policy initiated by his hated predecessor, Donald Trump. Except, of course, for one major difference. Trump emphasized sovereignty, unilateral action, almost total disengagement, whereas Biden emphasized a collective security and the revival of the besieged NATO and other security organizations. But in terms of the desire to disengage, at least from the periphery of the international system, from sources of crisis, friction, and conflict, Biden continued in the tradition of his predecessors since the debacle in Iraq. From Bush days and then all the way to Trump and previously to Obama. Namely, he supported the notion of phased withdrawal, which culminated in the most dismal way in Afghanistan. But the process had begun 10 years later. Of course, and Biden, when he was still vice president, acquiesced in the Russian encroachment and nibbling, whether it took place in Georgia, Abkhazia, and Ossetia, whether it took place in eastern Ukraine, of course, the kind of nibbling of eastern provinces, and of course annexation, unprovoked annexation of Crimea. And in Syria, he was vice president and he acquiesced, he was secondary partner to the deal, to the despicable deal between Kerry and Lavrov, which made the Russians the broker, peace brokers in dismantling Syrian chemical capacity. And we know how it worked. So in this respect, Biden continued the basic premises of his predecessors, reliance on soft power, again, soft power. And when the war in Ukraine broke out, he emphasized repeatedly, we are not going to set foot to send American troops to fight. So he insisted on reliance on soft power, of course, collective security, but don't forget, the enemy number one, the opponent number one, the danger number one, which faced the US was not Russia. It was China. To the extent that the administration was preoccupied with foreign policy. Don't forget the agenda. Don't forget the perspective. The struggle or the gigantic fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And Biden's most ambitious domestic agenda. And of course, with a very narrow margin of support in the Senate, most of his resources were devoted to advance his political domestic agenda. Okay, now, so it was disengagement, plus soft power, plus rebuilding alliances. Maybe it's contradictory, but that was the essence of his foreign policy and strategy orientation. What happened when the war broke out? Well, initially, and almost until now, one can say that the Biden administration pursued a very coherent policy of toughness combined with caution, measured toughness, a sequence of escalating, more penetrative, more intrusive economic and political sanctions against Russia, and uniting and actually reinvigorating NATO, which was a major accomplishment. The point is, first of all, in parentheses, if the Democrats lose the midterm elections on the 8th, November the 8th, I don't imagine that the Republicans, despite being hawkish, would appropriate such huge packages of economic assistance to Ukraine, which exceed now $13 billion. That's in parentheses. But I think the reliance on the tool of economic sanctions was excessive. It was a very American approach, reliance of the balance of capabilities, in believing that Putin would be sensitive and vulnerable and would act according to a rational choice, American rational choice model, that actually he would be deprived of essential raw materials and would not acquiesce, but soften his position in view of the mounting embargo. Well, I think the administration had become too rigidly committed to one strategy, using the economic leverage as a tool to influence the Kremlin. And I think, as far as I know, economic sanctions as a major or exclusive tool in foreign policy hardly worked. It took 20 years to the West to bring Gaddafi to more or less to acquiesce. 20 years of sanctions. South Africa is another case. There are always defectors. You need to impose embargo in a very hermetic way. All the parties have to sacrifice their intrinsic or selfish interest for the sake of the collective good. And you see today, the major defectors are, of course, China and Iran, and to an extent India. It's not working in a hermetic way, and there are always loopholes, and there are always leverage which Moscow can exert. And it is exerting. So despite the fact that the invasion of Ukraine was brutal, barbaric, aggressive, unprovoked, frankly, I feel a bit nostalgic about the Kissinger era. Because Kissinger was much more creative and flexible in terms of using the various sticks, plus even carrots. Not that Putin deserves any carrot, but at least to mix the tactics and even to provide Putin with a semblance, with a kind of a facade of a tactical accomplishment concerning, for example, the future of Ukraine's ties with NATO. But of course, to give him a way to climb, somehow to maintain, to save face. Not to, God forbid, appease him or try to conciliate him. But Kissinger was, I would say, the architect of political realism, divide and rule, drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. And obviously, when you drive the wedge, you have more policy options. You can manipulate. Now what is happening? Biden, maybe inadvertently, but made China and Russia almost close friends out of default. Well, human rights are essential. I forgot to mention that it was, 5 minutes? I almost started the introduction. Hardly started the introduction. After all, human rights and concern for human rights violations is essential and altruistic and to be desired. But, well, if China was on your top of your enemies list, how come that you exacerbate the situation and the rivalries simultaneously with Russia, with China, and with Saudi, with the Saudis? As an icing on the cake, of course, the assassination of Adnan Khashoggi was barbaric, was gruesome. But again, there are also considerations of realpolitik. And you cannot afford another squabble or quarrel with the Saudis. You need them today, strategically, in terms of oil. And so the point is, I see among the Biden entourage, I don't see creativity. I see a group of technicians, capable, competent, but outdated. Again, thinking in terms of Cold War rhetoric, as if Russia must be taught another lesson, as if the domino is still alive, domino theory. Namely, if you don't contain Russia now, tomorrow it will be Romania, Poland, etc., etc. I think that Putin had it, despite the fact that his arrogance and stupidity and isolation led him to his ill-fated adventure in Ukraine. I don't think that you have to push too far. You have to punish Russia, to continue with intrusive sanctions, but to let him at least a way out without acquiescing, without accepting and recognizing any of his occupations, needless to say. But you need some creativity. And I guess Kissinger is still around, by the way. He will celebrate his 100th birthday in August, if I'm not mistaken. And he is still kicking and he's still mentally alert. I think policymakers such as Sullivan or Blinken, I don't think that they have the necessary creativity to deal with the dynamics of a changing world order. In other words, to rely on terms such as a containment, deterrence. it's not just futile or outdated, it's dangerous because war can easily escalate out of miscalculation. We can, for example, the American Airborne 101 Division has now been dispatched to the border of Ukraine and Romania. I guess the possibility of some skirmishes, unintended confrontation, which may easily escalate, should not be underestimated. In other words, yes, the US still insists on no boots on the ground, but in fact, the US is there. And of course, the US should supply Zelensky with everything, from intelligence to defense systems, for whatever they need. But to dispatch troops to the border, and sometimes, again, it makes danger of conflagration very imminent. And again, Putin's logic works differently. It's not the same operational code. He is not sensitive to the costs in the same way that Western politicians are. He doesn't have public opinion. Yes, there are pockets of opposition and discontent, but still he has much more leverage and, of course, strong KGB and etc. to remain in power. It's not, again, American diplomacy has remained ethnocentric. It is viewing Russia in the same way that it is viewing any other Western power. And it's not a matter of capabilities, balance of capabilities. It's a matter of resolve, motivation, and again, sometimes Putin may act out of defiance, of despair. Time is up, so I'm just suggesting a few provocative remarks, and maybe it may sound a bit revisionist. I'm suggesting more flexibility, open-mindedness. Don't lose sight of what is essential to the stability of the international order, and again, so this is the bottom line, which is not even tentative, it's just some thoughts to be pursued, to be criticized. I'm willing to accept everything. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ben-Zvi. Our next speaker is Dr. Emmanuelle Blanc. She will talk about the European perspective. She is currently a lecturer in international relations at the School of Political Sciences and at the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. Her primary research interest lies in the study of EU foreign policy, diplomacy, and the role of emotions in world politics. Prior to joining the HCGES, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the International Relations Department at the London School of Economics, in which she also received her PhD. Her work has been published in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations, and in the Journal of International Relations and Development, and in Politics. So, go ahead. Oh, you need to escape?
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ziv, for introducing me. So, Professor Ben-Zvi just gave us the US perspective on the war in Ukraine, and what I'd like to do now is to take you to the other side of the Atlantic, closer to the theater of the war, to Europe. Why Europe? Well, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine marks the most consequential moment in European history since World War II. The outcome of this war, be it Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat or vice versa, is existential, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but likely for the whole continent, and will determine Europe's future for decades to come. So let's take a deep dive into the European response to the war in Ukraine. I guess that you've all heard about the numerous packages that the European Union has imposed on Russia, or seen these press images of high-level political leaders visiting Kiev, displaying their solidarity with the Ukrainian people. These are just a few manifestations of the European response to the war in Ukraine that has been described, at least in its very initial phase, as extraordinary, unprecedented, exceptional by European standards. In fact, for many observers and politicians alike, Europeans have discovered that they are a more serious force than they previously thought. For commentator Noises Naim, Europe discovered that it is a superpower. And indeed, Europeans themselves have been surprised by their unity and decisiveness in the very first phase of the war. Vladimir Putin was also very surprised and didn't expect such a unity and resolve on the European side. So in the European press, for those of you who have followed, you would have seen a lot of cartoons of this kind, featuring a superpower Europe flexing its diplomatic, economic, and even military muscle. But as the war enters its 8th month, with economic ripple effects being felt across the continent, and no end of the war in sight, it is worth asking, is the EU still as united as it used to be when the war started? Is the EU doing enough? And what really endangers its sustained engagement over time? In other words, what are the prospects of what are the prospects of a sustained European engagement in support of Ukraine? So what I'd like to do in my short talk today is, first of all, to discuss the extent to which the European response to the war in Ukraine has indeed been exceptional. Very often we tend to neglect Europe, to think that they are, too much focused on soft power, that they can't do really anything, that they disagree all the time among themselves. So I'd like to show you that in this crisis, at least Europe has shown that it can act decisively. Then I highlight a few important cracks emerging between and within European countries, as well as beyond, a potential rift with the United States coming up. And finally, I'll discuss the direction that the EU might take in the future. So let's start with a very brief review of the European response to the war in Ukraine. You might remember that just a few days after the invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative of the European Union, compared the EU as a geopolitical giant that has been awakened by Russian aggression of Ukraine. Similar comments were made by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Emmanuel Macron in France, that it was a dramatic moment in European history and that it called for a huge display of courage. Of course, the world was watching Europe, so it comes as no surprise that these leaders would engage in such a dramatic rhetoric and self-congratulatory tone. But has the EU's response been that remarkable? Well, there is a consensus that it did. Amid a poly-crisis, the EU has gone through many different crises over the last decade, and yet it is now rediscovering its strength. In short, many agreed that this war has made Europe great again. Since the very beginning of the war, Europeans had to walk a very thin line, trying to help, on the one hand, Ukraine to resist, without escalating further the confrontation with Russia. And so they engaged in a series of firsts. For those of you who are not very familiar with the EU, you might say, well, these are just normal things that any international actor could do. But for the EU, these are very big achievements. First of all, one thing that was exceptional was the rapidity of the decision-making process. So in procedural terms, it was one of the first time that the European Union managed to deploy a very united response in a very short period of time. As you may know, the European Union needs for its decision in foreign policy making a unanimity of 27 member states. Try to imagine 27 member states with different interests, different threat perceptions depending on their geographical proximity to Russia, for instance, different histories and traumas, different political cultures. They have to come together, raise their hands or vote electronically and decide to go for a specific action together. This is unprecedented in the world, and yet in this specific context, European leaders have managed to do that. So normally EU decision-making is slow, timid, there are cumbersome bureaucratic procedures and internal divisions that block the process, but here the EU managed to agree on far-reaching measures. So not only was the response quick, but it was also very comprehensive. The EU deployed all the possible instruments that it has at its disposal, ranging from the more traditional ones, such as the provision of humanitarian aid, diplomatic efforts, mainly led by France to try to resolve the conflict, but also, for the first time, coercive and restrictive measures. Sweeping economic sanctions, the most important ones in the history of the EU, and also, for the first time, the decision to finance the delivery of lethal weapons to a third country. The EU is an actor that wants to put war behind, is very reluctant to fuel conflicts around the world, that rather would send peacekeeping forces, but would not be actively engaged in supporting militarily a conflict. And here, they felt that it was requested. More recently, they also agreed that they would train Ukrainian soldiers in Europe to try to boost Ukrainian defense capabilities. Another very important instrument that the EU deployed, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, is that they agreed to grant Ukraine the status of candidate for accession to the European Union. This is also a very big deal, but they felt that it was necessary to give hope to Ukrainians and really justify also their fight, because this is a fight about their orientation and their willingness to turn more to the West. And finally, another measure that was taken and that is not obvious when you consider right-wing populist movements across Europe is the fact that they're granted temporary residency and right to work legally up to 3 years in the European Union to any Ukrainian refugees. You know that refugees are a very sensitive topic in Europe, and as of today, you can see here there are 4.2 million Ukrainian refugees registered for the EU temporary protection scheme. Most of the refugees, as you can see here on the table, have moved to wealthiest European countries. More than 1 million refugees in Poland, but also Germany, the Czech Republic, and Italy. So you've seen these pictures of displays in the newspaper. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the EU Commission, congratulating President Zelensky and happily announcing him that Ukraine could start its process to join the European Union and become a member in the future. You can see here European leaders, Mario Draghi from Italy, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz on the ground, witnessing the scale of the destruction and war atrocities. Okay, now, this was the beginning of the war. Where are we 8 months later? Well, key for an effective support to Ukraine is European unity. And Vladimir Putin is very well aware of that. That's why he's been pursuing a divide and rule approach towards the European Union and towards the Western camp more broadly, he counts on European disunity and weakening of the transatlantic alliance in order to achieve its objectives and weaken the European response. He's done that by weaponizing energy. You can see here on the map that obviously not all the European countries are not exposed to the same degree to the dependency on Russian gas. And this, of course, creates a lot of tensions among the member states that have to decide to take tough measures together. He has also been weaponizing migration together with Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. I can come back to that if you want later on. But what I'd like to emphasize in the remaining minutes are really the main cracks in the edifice of European solidarity that we're starting to see. And I want to point to three main fault lines. The first one is that the Franco-German couple is in trouble. As this French important newspaper headline indicated, things are not going well between France and Germany. Oh la la. It's a nice word play on the visit of Olaf Scholz to Paris last week. There is no personal chemistry between these two leaders, but more importantly, they disagree on energy, on how best to cope with rising energy prices across Europe. There are also differences regarding the defense industry. President Emmanuel Macron is very much in favor of promoting strategic autonomy of Europe. He wants to boost the European defense industry. And on the back of this decision, President Scholz decided to push forward with buying many American F-35 jet fighters that would undermine this project of boosting European industry. There are also concerns regarding Germany's relationship with China. But more fundamentally, Emmanuel Macron is worried that in the near future, Germany will start really taking a more pivotal role in Europe, and that will lead to the marginalization of France in the West, whereas Europe will start extending to the Balkans and also to the East. Another shift within the European Union is that the center of gravity is actually moving to the East. It's not just that the French-German duo is not going well, but their authority is being challenged by the Baltic, the Central and Scandinavian countries that are much more closer to Russia and that reproach Germany and France to have been too complacent vis-à-vis Vladimir Putin, to have committed too many mistakes in the past. And so they would rather turn to the United States to ensure the security because they don't feel that they're in good hands relying only on those two leaders that traditionally have been the engine of the European integration, and here that seem to be at loggerheads. We might come back to that in the Q&A, but I wanted to show you here is that most of the countries that are providing military aid, humanitarian aid, and financial aid are, by percentage of their GDP, are Estonia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Czech Republic, much more than Britain, Germany, or even France. You see it's really at the end of the graph, so it shows that these countries are really doing much more than the traditional founding member states. We've talked a little bit about the American perspective, but this is a potential rift that we will have to witness. There are more and more voices being heard in the corridors of power in Washington, mainly coming from Republicans, that Europe needs to step up. So it's the old free-riding arguments according to which Europe is not doing enough to ensure its own security. And in a way, if you look at the numbers, this criticism is justified. Look at the prevailing support of the United States together, both in military and economic terms. The United States provide more support to Ukraine than all the European countries together, including the United Kingdom. So it will be interesting to see, after the midterm election, to what extent the US commitment still holds. So to conclude, there is no doubt that the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest geopolitical challenges facing Europe in the 21st century. And what will determine the end of this war and the future of Europe as a whole will be to what extent the European Union manages to remain united. But I am optimistic, and I would quote to finish one of the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, that wrote in his memoir back in 1976, "I have always believed that Europe would be built through crisis and would be the sum of their solutions." So this is not the first and this is not the last crisis that the EU has to navigate, and hopefully they will overcome all these disagreements and move forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Okay. So our third speaker, introduce. Oh. If I'm gonna take it too long? If I'm gonna take it. Oh, okay. Okay. So the third speaker is Dr. Doron Elam. He is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations in the School of Political Sciences in the University of Haifa. He received his PhD from the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University, after which he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Munk School at the University of Toronto. His research interests include China's foreign policy, international organizations, international political economy, and FDI screening mechanism. Doron?
No, שנייה. Okay.
So thank you, Ziv, for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here to this conference, very important conference. And I will speak a little bit about the Chinese perspective in regards to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I will show just my main points. I will start with China's relations with Russia very briefly, then China's relations with the Ukraine, and then economic and strategic implications of the war on China, and then the connection to the Taiwan question, and I will end with what China is learning or can learn from this conflict. Okay, I hope you can see that because the projection is a little bit unfocused, but first of all, the China-Russia relationship is both strategic and economic. So during the Beijing Winter Olympics, Putin and Xi Jinping declared on a no-limits partnership. And what does that mean? We don't really know. We just know that it is a very important partnership, that the relations are becoming stronger, are becoming more connected. And this is prior to the Russian invasion to the Ukraine, and it's safe to say, we can assume that Putin told Xi Jinping that he might intend to invade the Ukraine, but we really don't know, but still they signed this partnership. Both Russia and China are like-minded in terms that they are both against US supremacy, US dominance in the international arena. And they have an informal alliance against the US and against the West in general, alongside with other like-minded nations such as Iran. Both of those nations are founding members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a very important and well, maybe underrated and not very well known in the West organization. Some say it might even challenge NATO in the future. And this is a security, maybe a non-traditional security-oriented organization. They are also both founding members of the BRICS, alongside with Brazil, South Africa, and India. Again, a very important economic, mainly economic forum. However, both nations are competing in several aspects. They compete in weapon sales, although the weapons of the Russians are much more superior and they're a greater supplier of weapons, but still the Chinese are slowly moving ahead. Again, they're also competing over influence in Central Asia. On over key states in Central Asia. Central Asia is traditionally was under the Russian and Soviet sphere of influence, but now the Chinese are coming and starting to invest economically and strengthening their ties with states in the area. And again, they have inherent mutual suspicion. Since way back in the 1960s and 70s, where the Soviets and the Chinese relations actually went into some kind of a tremor. But since then, they have mutual suspicions, and not much love is in this relationship. Again, I don't think you can really see, but in terms of trade, Russia is a very important trade partner for China, but China is more important for Russia. Trade is about 100 billion, give or take, yearly, and a lot of oil and gas is being imported from Russia to China. And we see that Russia has exported more oil and more energy to China after the crisis has emerged, the conflict has emerged. You can see here that Russia probably exports 15% of China's overall oil, and this has increased since January 2021 until May 2022. Briefly, China-Ukraine. The China-Ukraine relationship is mainly based on trade and economic. Ukraine is a very important supplier, or a big supplier of food to China, sunflower meals and so forth. However, strategically, Ukraine is on the west side, right? It's on the opposite side. It wants to join NATO, and it supports NATO expansion by its joining. And it's allied with the US and the big economic countries. And so in terms of trade and economy, Russia is more important to China than the Ukraine. And strategically, it's in the wrong position. So what are the war's implications on China? So first of all, further disruptions in supply chains of energy and supply chains in general, in a lot of products, from technology to food to energy. And so the war is not so good for China. It started in an uncomfortable situation for China prior to the 20th CCP Congress, which successfully ended several days ago. And it further disrupts the supply chains of the world, and for China in particular. But however, China can actually, or it needs, or it can import more oil and gas from Russia, maybe at a discount, because Russia it loses some of its partners, not all of them, as we saw in Europe, but it loses some of its partners, and it needs to sell its energy somewhere, and China is willing and happily willing to take these imports to it, because it needs this energy for its industry, both both military and civilian industry. This conflict actually prompted China to take a side. And we saw that China and its leaders weren't very eager to take Russia's side and to support Russia, at least not materially. In rhetorics, we saw support for Russia. China actually supported Russia's claim. It said, okay, NATO expansion is very bad. It's in your backyard. It's a security risk, and so forth. And therefore, we support your claims. But they have yet to support Russia materially, at least not officially. So that has put China in a rather, I think, problematic situation. And it becomes even more problematic because China adheres to the non-intervention principle. This is a very important principle in China's foreign policy, where it supports the notion that states should not intervene in other states' internal affairs, sovereignty, etc. So what do you do when another state invades another state? And so what do you do? It actually contradicts this principle. And so China was very uncomfortable with this invasion because because it can't stand behind something that actually contradicts its very important principle of non-intervention. So right now it's really starting to think about what it's going to do. And the Taiwan question, of course, I think this is the main question, whether the Ukraine is similar to Taiwan. Is Taiwan China's Ukraine, right? Whether China will actually look at the crisis right now and think, okay, so this is what happens when a big country, a very important nuclear country, invades another country, and what are the reactions by the West? And this is where we go to the last slide. I think, what is China learning from all of this conflict? So, first of all, China hates to lose an opportunity. Although it's not a very comfortable venue right now, it sees an opportunity and it will exploit it. So it learns how to avoid or prevent sanctions in a case where in the future it might have to invade Taiwan in order to reunificate it with mainland China. So it tries to do two things which are, I think, a bit contradictory. First of all, it actually tries to get more dependent and get more dependencies from the West, make the West dependent upon its products, upon the supply chains that go through or originate in China, and make it invaluable for the West. So when the West decides, if and when the West decides to employ sanctions on China, it will have to think twice, because it will say, okay, if I'll do this and that, then my economy will suffer greatly, and I cannot actually bear the costs of employing sanctions on China. And she sees what the West is doing to Russia, and it sees that the West is a bit stuttering with its sanctions. A lot of European countries are still importing oil and gas from Russia, and the sanctions are working partially. So it's a good sign for China, I think. And the other thing that China is doing is actually accelerating the decoupling from the West and from the US in particular, although the US is making most of the moves right now. But still, China is actually trying to establish its self-reliance mechanisms, trying to develop what it needs in terms of technology, especially at home, trying to actually not be dependent upon Western technology and Western imports of various products. So it does those two things in parallel, although they are contradictory. And second, avoid getting stuck in the mud in a future China-Taiwan conflict. This is more strategic, what to do or not to do when you invade another country. But of course, Taiwan is very different geographically from Ukraine. It's a heavy fortified island, specifically against Chinese invasion. It's the biggest developer and a manufacturer of chips and semiconductors. So this is something that is very, very important for the world right now. And once it's a bit more important than grain that is being grown in Ukraine. So this is a bit different, but still, China is learning how to invade a country more effectively, I think. And lastly, thank you. And lastly, taking further advantage of dependencies. So this relates to the first point, where it sees the world, the Western hemisphere, how it is dependent upon Russian oil and Russian energy, and it thinks to itself, how can I actually take advantage of these dependencies in the future and actually raise the costs for Western sanctions and any kind of negative reaction by the West, so they might not be able to react to any further policy by China, whether it is Taiwan invasion or expansion in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or any further human rights issues in the Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs, etc. So it learns, it watches, it learns, and now that the Congress has concluded successfully, especially for Xi Jinping, which is continuing to a third term and maybe to fourth and fifth term, it learns how to actually strengthen itself and not repeat the mistakes of Russia in this conflict. Thank you.
Our last but not least speaker is Dr. Galia Lindenstrauss. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, and specializes in Turkish foreign policy. Her additional research interests are ethnic conflicts, Azerbaijan's foreign policy, and the Cyprus issue and the Kurds. Galia?
So, hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this conference and with with other distinguished lectures. I will talk to you about Turkey and the war in Ukraine. It should have been a rather straightforward story. Turkey has been a member of NATO since 1952, so it should have been a steadfast support for Ukraine, and it should have been exactly similar to what was just discussed by Dr. Blank. Very strong objection to Russian actions in Ukraine. But in reality, it was more complex. We saw all sorts of contradictions between Turkish rhetoric, which was in favor of Ukrainian territorial integrity. But on the other hand, we saw actions such as not joining the European sanctions, actions such as allowing Russian civil aircraft to still use Turkish airspace. So basically, Russian citizens that want to go abroad, many of them are using Turkey as the outlet to other countries. And on the other hand, we also see Turkey supplying Ukraine with the TB2 drones of the Bayraktar company, which have been very successful in Ukraine, but also in other arenas. So this war is not comfortable for Turkey, I would say. It has both good relations with Ukraine and with Russia. And hence, I titled my presentation with challenges, opportunities, and also surprises, because the international realm is always surprising us also. The Ukrainian war comes at a time where basically we see that Turkey-Russia relations are in a relative high. Now, one should never overstate that Russia and Turkey enjoy good relations. They are still very, very much suspect each other, and they have a history that basically Russia was one of the more dangerous countries to Turkey over history. But again, having said that, relatively we have very good relations today between Russia and Turkey. We see that Turkey has acquired in 2017 the S-400 defense system, air defense system from Russia. This has caused an outcry in NATO. It is seen as a Trojan horse from a NATO states' perspective. And as a response, Turkey was expelled from the F-35 project. Russia is building Turkey's first nuclear civilian power plant. It is supposed to, the first unit is supposed to become operational in 2023. And Russia is also a big supplier of gas to Turkey, and they started building the Turk Stream in 2017, which was, by the way, one of the responses to the 2014 Crimean annexation, and that Russia needed to bypass the more northern parts of the Black Sea, and hence they built the Turk Stream. And these are only 3 examples of very serious strategic projects in which you see cooperation between Russia and Turkey. I also have to say that in a way, Turkey joins Russia in challenging the liberal international order. Also, Turkey is not completely satisfied with the current international order and with the Western international order. Here you see Erdogan in front of the General Assembly with his mantra, the world is bigger than 5. He has been saying that consistently since 2013, and basically saying that the world order that was established after World War II needs updating. It cannot be that there are 5 countries in the Security Council and none of them are a Muslim state, for example. Okay, this is something he's been challenging. Another issue is that I have to highlight is that despite, again, Turkey being a NATO member since 1952, there are strong anti-American feelings in Turkey. When you have to analyze it, you go back to the Cyprus conflict, in which the US first stopped Turkey from operating in Cyprus and then did a weapons embargo on Turkey. Later in 2003, in the context of the Iraq invasion, there was the Hood incident in which American soldiers hooded Turkish soldiers. Later, if you get into the Syrian civil war, we see that Turkey backed the Syrian branch of the PKK, this Kurdish terror group. This was also something that is still a source of antagonism between Turkey and the US. And here in this picture, you see a Turkish interior minister saying out loud that the US was behind the failed coup attempt in Turkey in 2016. Now, it's one thing to think these things behind closed door, but it's another thing to say this out in the open. And indeed, when you look at who, what did I do? Sorry. When you look at who Turks perceive as their enemies, actually the US comes very high. Sometimes it tops the list. This year, this is a survey from 2021. It only came 3rd, with Armenia first, and Israel, by the way, coming 2nd. But more than 56% of those asked said that the US is a threat to Turkey. Okay, in the same survey, by the way, 40% said Russia is a threat to Turkey. So basically, if you look at, by the way, this survey, Turkey has only 2 friends in the world, which is Azerbaijan and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which only Turkey recognizes. Apart from that, Turkey thinks Turkish citizens think that everybody is a threat, but the US tops the list. That's a concern. Now, Putin and Erdogan also enjoy, they have some understanding between them. You know, they're both leading autocratic regimes, some more, some less, but they are both they are in that direction. They both don't like intervention. If we talk about the previous lecture about the Chinese not liking intervention in internal affairs, so do, in this respect, Erdogan and Putin see eye to eye. But here, Putin is like this, I'm sure you all have this relative that gives you a compliment and at the same time gives you an insult. So here also last week, Putin says that, oh yes, Erdogan is reliable and he's a strong leader, but he's not an easy partner. So they also have their problem. Now, in terms of what challenges does the war in Ukraine create to Turkey? So first of all, as I said earlier, Turkey enjoys both close relations with Russia and Ukraine. I just elaborated Russia, but let me elaborate a little bit more about Ukraine. As I said, Ukraine purchased from Turkey these drones, but they also plan to manufacture these drones, to do joint production of these drones on Ukraine. And another thing is, of course, Ukraine as being a supplier of wheat to Turkey. That's a very major issue, not only in Turkey, but also in other Middle Eastern countries. Like the Israeli dilemma that was presented in the previous panel, of course, Russia has leverage over Turkey in Syria. Also, we could add Libya and Azerbaijan, but I would say very importantly the issue of Idlib, which is still an unresolved issue in Syria. If Russia lets things get out of hand in Idlib, that means another 1 million refugees to add to the already existing 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Of course, when we talk about the war in Ukraine, it's also the Black Sea arena, which Turkey is also a country in this arena. So Turkey doesn't want Russian dominance in the Black Sea. It wants Ukraine as a balance against Russia. There's a deep economic crisis currently in Turkey. We're talking about official inflation 80%, but unofficial data are talking about more than 150% inflation. Nobody wants rising prices, nor of energy, nor of food, in such a time of deep economic crisis. Of course, we are all here concerned, and that's a part of the reason we have this conference, that we will, this conflict will escalate even further. And the last issue is that there is the Tatars, which is a Turk people in Crimea. This was also already a source of concern, of course, with the 2014 annexation, but this is still something that we know the Turkish public is concerned about. But as, again, Dr. Ela presented, the crisis is also opportunity. And Turkey has proven to be an effective mediator. If you look to who even tried the challenge of mediating in this conflict, and you look who succeeded, you basically end up only with Turkey. And Turkey was an effective mediator. We saw it in the grain deal, which now just recently Russia suspended, but hopefully we will get back to this grain deal, which is very important for all the actors that are importing wheat and other agriculture products from Russia and Ukraine. From Turkish perspective, NATO is very important for its national security. With all the previous things I said, at the end of the day, Turkey puts a lot of its belief and strategic thinking in NATO, and hence it is good for Turkey that NATO is strengthening. Turkey is the second largest army in NATO, and Turkey is one of the countries that did do enough defense spending over the years from its national budget, and so it's happy to see that the other NATO countries are moving ahead in their defense spending. We did see that Turkey has been gaining some in the economic field from the need of Russia to circumvent sanctions. We see all sorts of money somehow popping up in Turkey, which we don't completely know the source, but we can guess that some of this is Russian money. So this has been comfortable. It has been useful, let's say, in this economic crisis. And lastly, Turkey sees itself as an energy hub. And Turkey and Russia are already talking about strengthening the energy ties between them, and that Turkey will be a more major hub for Russian energy. And also the Mediterranean gas, Turkey would want to see itself more involved in the export of gas from the East Mediterranean. It just, by the way, just congratulated Israel and Lebanon for reaching the agreement about the gas. And here it is competing with Egypt, which de facto has been proved the energy hub that most countries in the region have chosen. But you never know. In the future, things might change. And I promised surprises also. So I think one of the things that maybe somebody who's been following the issue of drones very closely did expect, but for the other people who are not that focused on the issue of drones, I think the fact that we have Turkish drones on the one hand with Ukraine and now Iranian drones with Russia is a surprising in this such a global conflict that we have these two Middle Eastern regional countries that are having a say on the battleground. I think that's an interesting development. Another issue is this veto that Turkey did about NATO, about Sweden and Finland joining NATO. I have to say that in the past, Swedish-Turkish relations were excellent. When you looked at it, public opinion polls, Sweden was one of the few countries in which the public was favorable to Turkish accession to the EU. But today, as I said, Turkey is vetoing Sweden joining NATO. And in this respect, we have to pay attention to diasporas. We have a large Kurdish diaspora in Sweden, and we have also a large Gulen diaspora, or not large, but an influential Gulen diaspora. Gulen is, thank you. Gulen is this preacher that, from the Turkish government's perspective, was behind the failed coup in 2016. So from Turkish perspective, Sweden is hosting those who were part of the failed coup in 2016. So that's in terms of surprises. I'll conclude by saying that Turkey is walking a fine line, and as you know, if you walk a fine line, you can also fall. So that's dangerous. The war in Ukraine didn't invent the tensions between Turkey and its NATO allies. These were already existence, but they just exemplify what these mean in practice when, if things are not good in calm times, they also sometimes are not good in times of crisis. A big question, of course, how long will the West be patient to this ambivalent position? On the one hand, we see that there is compliments for the fact that Turkey is a negotiator, and there is some patience that because it's negotiator, it has to be more balanced in its position. But as the conflict becomes more extreme, maybe there will be less patient. And lastly, and this is a conclusion that is relevant to the Middle East region in general, is that we see many countries in the region, which again might support the decisions against Russia in the General Assembly, but otherwise are very ambivalent and are not completely in the pro-Western camp the way at least the US and Europe would want. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, and I would want to allow the audience to speak in a second, but meanwhile, I'll take the chair's prerogative to throw in a few questions of my own from your wonderful presentations. Two things, I guess, to the representatives of the West, that's Avi and Emmanuel. I was wondering about the span of attention that they can still go with Ukraine so powerfully as they are. Avi, you hinted that perhaps a Republican victory next week would end the American support. I was wondering if it wouldn't happen anyway. That the United States just cannot continue with this for so long. Emmanuel, on this end, I would also ask the same thing, where I guess there should be some kind of a split between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Say even in energy, you know that Western Europe doesn't really rely on Russia as Eastern and Central Europe is. So at what point might they actually start splitting on this again, where political attention is no longer at the same level, that you can't hold it for so long. Doron, I had a question for you. Was China surprised like Russia with the Western backing of Ukraine? With their operation, which seems very, I mean, they united the West, right? Putin seemed to have united NATO. Did that surprise China, and what did they learn from that? Galia, well, I guess all of you, in a way, are saying this war is uncomfortable to everyone, right? Which is good, maybe good, normatively to say. And you actually wrote down something in your conclusion that I wanted to expand on. Will Turkey be punished for working, I mean, within NATO or in future relations with the EU? These are my questions. Perhaps now I'll give the audience a chance. If anyone has, okay, so do you have the mic? You need mine? Oh. Okay. I'll need to steal this one. I saw someone there. Okay, those who want to ask questions, please raise your...
Questions from the audience,
I
yes.
have one there. And also one here.
Any more other than 2? Okay, 3. Okay.
Hi. Okay, I presented myself before, but one more time, my name is Paulo Galic. I'm from the Technion, but I'm originally from Ukraine. So I really enjoyed this part, actually more than the first one, I would say, because the first part, it had a lot of Russian narratives. Anyway, I really enjoy lectures about China and Turkey. And so I have this question regarding this Chinese, not NATO that was mentioned, or this Shanghai military alliance, if I understood correctly. So to the best of my knowledge, Russia and China, they did not sign like any military agreements, right? So who is in this alliance? Like, is it comparable to NATO? Like, because I've never heard about it. So just curious. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
Hello, professors. My name is Sophia. I'm a student at Germany and EU Studies. I come from China, and I have several questions for Dr. Doron. Your PPT is really interesting. Well, my first question is about the like-minded states regarding China and Russia. I would like you to illustrate a little bit more because I think for Russia and China, there are lots of different opinions between these two countries. I would like to mention that in history, especially in Qing dynasty, while Russia actually invaded China and take a part of the territory from China. So in talking about this non-limitation partnership, I think when talking about international relations, it's kind of delicate because each nation has its own important interests and their ultimate goals, that is to protect their interests, no matter how this diplomacy strategy is going to be set and how these principles are going to be made. So regarding this, I also want to ask the faraway conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, why should China really take sides on this? Because I think the starting point for China to make any policy, it's normal for China to consider its own national interests, right? It's the same for any states of this international community. It's the same for Israel. As previously our professor also mentioned, should Israel sell weapons to Ukraine, there will be a lot of influences and consequences for any behaviors or decisions that we make today. So why the Western society are pushing China to take sides? I think it's normal that if we decide this is good for China, then we make our free choices and decisions, and nobody should just force it to take sides based on some values, because each nation has its own values. And about human rights, about the democracy, the respect for science and democracy, in China we also respect this. So I think it's like common values. It's also well recognized and respected in China. And the second question is about the classification, the standards and criteria you mentioned when describing a country. For example, you have mentioned China, Russia, and Iran, or on a certain level, they're of a similar category. I don't quite understand this criteria. When talking about China, why shouldn't we mention the permanent membership of UN, which is a well-recognized international dispute resolution scheme? And why not mentioning China's contribution in maintaining regional peace, stability, and prosperity, and China's contribution through various organizations like BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organizations? So why when talking about China, we immediately talk about this Iran, South Korean, or North Korean, sorry, or Russia? And how does this category and classification comes? And the third question is...
Okay. You can wrap it
Okay,
up.
okay.
Thank you. Okay, another question?
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm from the Middle East Studies and Political Science. Joined the course. I have one question for the European Union and one for Turkey. For the European Union, I wanted to ask, we've noticed that in the last few months, in response to the Russian invasion, the Germans have increased the budget of their military and are now building up their military strength once again, hopefully with no further plans than that. I wanted to ask, are there other countries in the European Union who are following the same pattern, are now trying to rebuild and maybe create a more powerful military in response to the Russian aggression? And for Turkey, I wanted to ask, I've seen recently that the Turks opposed the joining of Sweden and Finland into a NATO alliance. I wanted to ask, why would they oppose that? And are there any other countries in Europe that haven't joined NATO yet? And would they oppose their joining into the NATO alliance as well?
Okay, thank you. I guess it's time for you to start answering. So let's go by the order. Do you want to come here?
Well, thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Somehow I believe that my presentation was very provocative, but apparently it was not, because I expected all kinds of backlash and criticism, but well, apparently it was very mild, very vegetarian. Anyway, referring to the only question actually which was directed at me, Ziv, you're absolutely right. I emphasize the Republican reluctance to appropriate huge amounts of economic packages, but I think it's more than the Republican partisan position. I think that there is I see undercurrents, more than undercurrents of erosion in the measure of American public support and congressional support for the war. After all, don't forget the fact that the war actually was directly responsible to the wave of uncontrolled inflation, which hit the American market. And it's all politics, it's not just economics. And with the rate of inflation, 8 plus 2 or %, etc., or something like this. And of course, everything is interconnected. And with the Saudis deciding all of a sudden to reduce the amount of oil for various considerations, the US is finding itself in a predicament, namely in terms of energy, in terms of using its own reserves, and in terms of the dwindling support for the Biden administration. And look at the erosion in the measure of his support recently. He lost 5% in terms of the public support, and is likely to lose both houses of Congress. And inflation is the key term, and I think that this is a major component in, let's say, reducing the level of American enthusiasm in support for Ukraine. That's number one. Only one side small remark concerning, because I think it's absolutely essential, the gap between idealism and realism, etc. It's something which is innate, which is inherent in American thinking. I think that Biden shifted a little bit toward a more idealistic extreme. He was a little bit carried away. And for example, I still don't understand, well, if he was behind Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, its timing, if it was connected, if the administration or his entourage was behind the scene, I don't think that it was very conducive and helpful. Although China was also, has not been a saint in terms of its commercial practices, in terms of its very ambitious strategic long-term design. But I think what I'm still hoping is for a more measured, nuanced, sophisticated, differentiated American policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So to your question, Ziv, regarding the span attention in Europe and the conflict in Ukraine, well, I think that the conflict is having so far-reaching ripple effects across all the European countries in so many realms of life that it will be very difficult to just forget about it and move to something else. If we just consider the prices of gas right now in Europe, gas prices are now 8 times what they were on average over the past 10 years. And so currently the energy ministers of European countries are meeting almost weekly in Brussels in order to try to come up with a common solution to manage the rise in gas prices. And as we know, due to the European way of decision making, this might take time. So if they fail to come to an agreement this week, they will meet again in 1 month and again until they will finally come to a decision. Another field, another area of policy that is being impacted by the war in Ukraine is the Green Deal of the European Union. You know that the EU has become a leadership in the fight for climate change, and the war in Ukraine, due to all its implications on energy provision, puts in danger all these ambitions to reach a net zero economy by 2015. So the EU is now launching a new initiative to try to balance, on the one hand, the need to reduce its energy dependency from Russia without coming back to polluting kind of sources of energy such as coal and other things. So I don't think that I think that the topic will remain, but the danger might rather come from the fragile support within European countries, whereby citizens are starting to feel the cost of this war. I was in France just a few weeks ago, and there are jokes running on the internet. We are seeing Emmanuel Macron wearing very warm clothes because the winter will be hard. Citizens are being told how to reduce their energy consumption. This is everywhere. So the danger might come from that, from less and less support from the citizens within Europe. As to the question on Germany's renewed expenses on defense, you're right. So 100 billion euros have been announced by Chancellor Olaf Scholz in a very important speech in the Bundestag, where he announced the Zeitwende, a huge turn in German's foreign defense policy and foreign policy that really shakes the very self-understanding of Germany as a power that, since World War II, has tried as much as possible to remain far away from anything that touches hard power, military power, to avoid coming back to a very worrying past. But now this is changing, and Germany is not the only country going this way. Across all Europe, there is an increase in defense spending. And this is something that the United States has been waiting for a long time. Donald Trump constantly criticizing the European partners not to be doing enough, not to invest enough money on defense. So now this is happening, and here again the challenge will be how. So as I mentioned during my talk, certain countries such as France will want really to boost the European-based defense industry and try to reduce the dependence on the United States. So it's the whole idea of strategic autonomy. There is a European defense fund that has been created in 2016. And on the other hand, there are countries that will buy more armaments from the United States because it is already available, it's sophisticated weapons. And a very last remark about that, I think that this will be very interesting to follow because this really raises fundamental questions as to the very nature of the European Union as an international player. We are going to see a union that has to do a lot of soul searching and redefine its very identity, not anymore only as a normative and civilian power, but as a power that now has to reinvent himself and cope with a world filled with dangers and realize that, like Benny said, the world is an anarchy, self-help system, and the EU has to learn how to play in this dangerous field.
Thank you. Go on.
Okay, so thank you for your questions, and I will be very brief because we're running out of time, and I have a class to teach. So first of all, was China surprised by the intervention? I think that I actually don't know because I can't really. I can guess. I can guess that maybe China knew something. Maybe Putin told Xi Jinping he invades. He plans to do something, but not in that scale and maybe not so quickly, because we've seen some patterns of surprise by the Chinese, at least in their statements and in their media, but nothing. But we really don't know. I don't really want to make any false assumptions. Regarding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is an organization that was established in 2005, and in it we find China, Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, India, and lately Iran. And this is, it deals with non-traditional security threats such as terror and the three evils. You can read it about it online. It's not a military alliance, but they conduct military exercises and they share intelligence, but they are not a military alliance so far. You can read about it more online. And for regarding Sophie's question, regarding China in general, I think, Russia did invade China during the 100 years of humiliation, as described. And still, why should China take a side? I don't think that the West is coercing China into taking a side. I think that each country, as you said, has its interests. And while China remains somewhat neutral, I think at least materially, not in rhetorics, China is all in favor of Russia, I think, most of the time, at least via its delegates' speeches in the UN and other multilateral forums. It is, in rhetorics, it supports Russia. But I think, again, when there's a conflict, it is expected someone to take a side, but you can remain neutral if you want. But, nobody is coercing China into taking Ukraine's side, or nobody is expecting and automatically for China to take Russia's side. And I don't think I've put China specifically in this category of, you know, like the like of these evil states, so North Korea, Iran, etc. But I think it does have something in common, maybe in common with these countries, because it resists. Maybe it's starting to resist the current international liberal order and trying to establish maybe an alternative order, institutional order at least, where in this order it will be better represented, and the developing countries, which China considers itself as their leader, will be better represented than they are now in the current liberal international order. But yeah, so I think I'm sure that you have, I think, great feelings toward your home country, and you know, like hearing people speak about your home country when you're abroad, it might stir up things, and it's totally understandable. Thank you.
Thank you. Dalia?
With regard to your question, Ziv, will Turkey be punished? I mean, as I said earlier, Turkey was already expelled from the F-35 project because it bought the S-400. And now there's the question whether it will be able to buy the F-16 from the US, and there's a lot of objection in the US Congress for this. And we will see. The administration itself is in favor, but that's an issue that is on the table today and is discussed. With regard to the economic sanctions, as Professor Ben-Zvi emphasized, this is a huge component of the Western response. Then after Erdogan met Putin in Tehran, there was an issue of 5 Turkish banks cooperating with the mere Russian credit card system. And for a time, Russian tourists could use Russian credit cards in Turkey. But after a lot of pressure on Turkey, these Turkish banks have stopped cooperating with the Russian banks. So that's an indication of such a punishment. With regard to the EU, of course, there's a lot of frustration of Turkey with its EU accession process. Over the years, Turkey is the only one who opened an accession process, and this process didn't end with Turkey joining the EU. The talks are still open, they're just frozen, but there's a lot of frustration of the fact that for Ukraine, there was so enthusiasm of Ukraine joining the EU, and there was such enthusiasm for Ukrainian refugees when, as we know, when there was the issue of the Syrian refugees, Europe basically said, no way. So this is a frustration issue. With regard to your question of why did Turkey object to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, I think this is a basic issue of Turkey saying, don't take us for granted. So from time to time, there's issues that come up in NATO, and Turkey at first says no, and later softens. So I think it will follow the same dynamic, and already Turkey in many ways softened. With regard to Finland, there's no problem. There's still the issue of Sweden. Turkey was mad at Sweden on 2 things. One was that there was a weapons embargo on Turkey. Following when Turkey invaded northern Syria in 2019, there was a fear that there would be ethnic cleansing of Kurds. So there was a very strong Western response, and Sweden did a weapons embargo. But since then, now with this issue of Sweden joining NATO, Sweden lifted the weapons embargo. So the last issue that remains is this issue of these Gulen diaspora and these Kurdish diaspora people that are on Swedish soil, and Turkey wants them out. That's still the open question.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for this fascinating panel. Thank you all. Thank you. And finally, for concluding remarks, I invite Professor Benny Miller, who is the head of the National Security Studies Center here at the university.
Let me thank the audience for the patience, for the interest, and for the great questions. Let me thank the speakers for very insightful talks. Just for concluding, what do we learn about the world from our conference and from the war in Ukraine? There is a lot of realpolitik, definitely, and realism can teach us a lot. But I think Professor Ben-Zvi highlighted a very important point, kind of the tension actually in realism between kind of resolve, maybe offensive, taking advantage of opportunities versus being restrained, very cautious, and because of the fear of unintended escalation, especially in this case, the fear of nuclear escalation. So Kissinger is a good, excellent example how to reconcile the two, even though, you know, there are still a lot of questions to ask about it, but on the whole, I think it's an excellent point that Avi raised. Liberalism showed its power by the unity of the West. However, we know that the West is not unified. There is a huge polarization. Actually, the reaction, the kind of the response, the harsh response to Russia is limited only to the West. There is no similar response beyond the liberal West, and also all the global liberal mechanism, economic independence, international institutions, globalization that liberals hope that will moderate conflict in the world didn't show their power, at least in this case, and it definitely shows their huge limits. Then finally, the power of nationalism. Definitely we see, you know, how national unification can motivate countries, or at least leaders, to initiate wars. And that's the claim, supposedly, of Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine. And that shows that it's not only security concern, kind of the realist point of view that motivated Putin in the invasion, even though realists emphasized the security, you know, NATO eastward expansion and so on as the key cause of this war. Then obviously we have to be very worried in this context about China and Taiwan, which is the biggest issue of national unification and how it can motivate a rising power or declining power, depending between Russia and China, you know, to initiate the use of force and to lead to major conflict and potentially even world wars. And on the other side, we see the huge power of defensive nationalism on the side of Ukraine. And here actually, and that's also with regard to Avi's excellent talk, I think the response of the United States was a bit complicated in the sense that initially the United States expected that Ukraine will be taken over by a few days by powerful Russia. It was actually the brave resistance of the Ukrainian, motivated by this defensive nationalism, that actually kind of compelled, even though it's debatable, obviously, compelled the United States to support Ukraine in a major way. And then, obviously, and especially the Secretary of Defense, then to take advantage of it kind of for an offensive realist purpose to weaken Russia. But then Kissinger would come and say, wow, we're taking a too heavy risk here and we have to think about nuclear escalation, God forbid, and to be sensitive to Putin and to Russia. So we see the power of this school of thought, but also the internal debates and the limits to each explanatory perspective. Again, thank you very much. A lot of thanks to the speakers for this excellent talks and issues that we can go and forward and talk about them and think about them. Thank you very much. Thank you.